They arrived on American soil not as soldiers, but as captives, carried across the Atlantic on troop ships under guard, with the salty wind carrying the bitter taste of defeat. For many of the German prisoners of war, their first vision of the United States came through the portholes of ships docking in ports like Norfolk, New York, or Boston. What they expected was grim, harsh treatment, cold barracks, and hunger. Yet what awaited them would begin to overturn every notion they carried about their enemy. The sheer scale of America was overwhelming. Vast ports filled with cranes, warehouses brimming with goods, trains rolling ceaselessly along the tracks. To men who had spent years enduring bombed-out cities and scarcity, this abundance seemed unreal. Escorted by military police, they boarded trains bound for inland camps scattered across the American countryside. The United States government had chosen to house over 400,000 German POWs in facilities stretching from Texas to Minnesota, from Alabama to California. The train windows revealed landscapes that were breathtakingly foreign, endless rows of corn, small towns with white church spires, and streets unscarred by bombing. For men who had last seen Europe in flames, it was almost incomprehensible to watch families strolling peacefully along sidewalks or farmers tending unburned fields. As the trains rolled deeper into the heartland, whispers passed among the prisoners. Some feared retribution, remembering Allied propaganda that portrayed Nazis as monstrous. Others quietly hoped for better conditions than the Eastern Front or bombed-out camps in Britain. At stations, groups of curious Americans sometimes gathered to watch the passing prisoners. The sight of German uniforms was jarring, but the crowds were not hostile. Children pointed, women stared, and occasionally someone even waved. This unnerved the POWs, who had braced themselves for hatred, but instead found a strange mixture of suspicion and casual curiosity. When they finally reached the camps, most were surprised by what they encountered. The camps themselves were not dungeons, but orderly compounds, often built hastily on open farmland. Rows of wooden barracks stood behind barbed wire fences, but inside those fences, life was not what they had imagined. Each man received a bunk, blankets, and meals, far exceeding the rations German civilians were living on back home. The food alone astonished them: meat, bread, milk, and even fruit. Soldiers accustomed to thin soups and ersatz coffee could hardly believe the portions set before them. Some later recalled in memoirs that the camp meals alone were more generous than anything they had eaten since the early years of the war. The Red Cross inspected regularly, and American authorities followed the Geneva Convention with a diligence that stunned many. They were allowed to write letters home, receive packages, and even attend classes organized within the camp. For the first time in years, they were not under the constant threat of bombs, bullets, or starvation. The environment, while restricted, offered a strange kind of safety. The initial bitterness of capture began to dissolve into reluctant acceptance, and among some, even gratitude. Still, uncertainty gnawed at them. They were soldiers stripped of purpose, stranded thousands of miles from home, their future unknown. Yet within weeks, as the rhythms of camp life settled, they began to notice something else: the quiet decency with which ordinary Americans treated them. The guards were firm, but not brutal. The surrounding communities did not look at them with venom. In the evenings, as they heard the distant sounds of church bells or families gathering beyond the fences, they realized they were living in a world untouched by war in ways they could scarcely imagine. And for many, that realization marked the beginning of a journey they had never anticipated, from enemies to uneasy guests in a land they had been taught to despise. Once the first shock of arrival passed, the reality of daily life inside the prisoner of war camps became clear. The U.S. Army had established these camps following strict guidelines, ensuring that prisoners were housed, clothed, and fed in accordance with international law. Each camp functioned almost like a small village, complete with kitchens, hospitals, workshops, and even chapels. The prisoners soon learned that their days were structured and every hour had its rhythm. At dawn, a bugle call woke the men, followed by roll call where guards accounted for each prisoner. Breakfast was served in large mess halls: eggs, bread, porridge, and sometimes even butter or jam. For Germans who remembered the rationing at home, such meals seemed almost surreal. Discipline was strict, but it was not cruel. After breakfast, the prisoners could attend language classes, participate in sports, or take part in work assignments. The American authorities believed in keeping the men occupied, both to reduce unrest and to help address the labor shortages caused by millions of American men serving overseas. Camps organized woodworking shops, tailoring services, and repair stations. POWs could fix shoes, sew uniforms, and even produce furniture for the camp's own needs. In some facilities, they were allowed to form orchestras, stage theater productions, and organize soccer tournaments. These activities were encouraged not only to maintain morale, but also to show the men that they were being treated as human beings, not as faceless enemies. Health care also shocked many of the prisoners. Each camp had a medical unit staffed by American doctors, and sometimes even German physicians among the prisoners were allowed to practice. Men received dental care, treatment for infections, and vaccinations. For soldiers who had marched through mud in worn boots or suffered untreated wounds on the front, the idea of clean infirmaries with proper beds and medicine felt almost like stepping into another world. Some later admitted that they had received better care in captivity than they had during their service in the Wehrmacht. Another unexpected aspect was the access to reading material. Libraries inside the camps offered not only German books supplied by the YMCA and Red Cross, but also American newspapers and magazines. For many prisoners, this became their first exposure to American culture beyond propaganda. They read about baseball scores, movie stars, and everyday life, glimpsing a society that was not living in constant fear of air raids. German officers often tried to discourage excessive engagement with these materials, fearing that morale would weaken, but curiosity proved stronger than orders. Perhaps most startling to the POWs was the fact that the camp guards rarely displayed hostility. American soldiers, many of them only a few years older than the prisoners, treated their captives with a mix of discipline and casual indifference. There were, of course, moments of tension, especially when news arrived of atrocities committed in Europe, but overall, the camps operated with an air of routine rather than vengeance. German POWs were astonished to find that even in a country whose sons were dying on battlefields against them, there was no systematic cruelty directed at them here. This daily structure slowly eroded the fears the prisoners had carried across the ocean. The barbed wire was still there, but life within it was unexpectedly bearable, even, at times, comfortable. The POWs began to adjust to this new rhythm, not knowing that soon their routines would carry them far beyond the camp fences, into the fields, barns, and kitchens of ordinary Americans whose lives were intertwined with the war in surprising ways. As the months passed, the demand for labor in the United States grew steadily. With millions of American men deployed overseas, entire sectors of the economy struggled to function. Agriculture, in particular, faced an acute shortage. Fields needed planting, harvests required hands, and food production could not simply halt because of the war. To solve this, the government authorized programs allowing German prisoners to work outside the wire under supervision. Farmers, many of whom had never seen a German soldier except in newspaper photos, suddenly found themselves depending on these men in gray or khaki uniforms to keep their livelihoods afloat. The first time trucks pulled up to a camp and groups of POWs were driven out to local farms, both sides felt a wary tension. For the Americans, these were supposed enemies who had fought against their sons in North Africa, Italy, or France. For the Germans, it was a step into unknown territory, out from the controlled safety of the camps into the world of civilians. Yet what began as guarded practicality often grew into something more human. Farmers quickly discovered that the Germans were skilled workers, accustomed to hard physical labor. Many of them had grown up tending fields in Bavaria, Saxony, or rural Prussia, and they handled plows, tractors, and livestock with practiced ease. Local communities noticed too. The image of the Nazi soldier, hardened and merciless, did not align with the young men who milked cows, stacked hay, or carefully repaired farm equipment. Families watched with surprise as these supposed enemies shared laughs with children, whittled wooden toys during breaks, or hummed folk tunes while working. For many Americans, it was their first real-life encounter with a German that wasn't filtered through wartime newsreels or propaganda posters. Payment for labor was handled through the government, not directly to the prisoners, but POWs were given coupons redeemable at the camp canteen. There they could purchase small luxuries, chocolate, tobacco, or stationery for letters home. These small privileges motivated them to work hard, and farmers in turn often slipped them extra food or small favors. Accounts from Kansas, Nebraska, and Texas describe how POWs returned to the camps at the end of long days, carrying apples, bread, or even slices of pie offered by grateful farm wives. Of course, suspicion never disappeared entirely. Guards always accompanied the men, and rules were strict. Yet escapes were remarkably rare, largely because the prisoners quickly realized they had little to gain. America was vast, strangers were everywhere, and even if they managed to flee, where could they go? Most stayed, grateful for the chance to spend time away from the monotony of the barbed wire. In many towns, the sight of German POWs became routine. Trucks arriving at dawn, men climbing down with tools in hand, the day's labor unfolding in the heat or chill. Over time, their presence sparked less fear and more familiarity. Farmers learned their names, heard stories about villages on the Rhine or mountains in Bavaria, and began to see them less as faceless enemies and more as young men caught in the machinery of a war far bigger than themselves. What nobody expected was how quickly this familiarity would soften into trust. Before long, some families went beyond offering food in the fields. They began to extend invitations. At first, it might be coffee on the porch or a sandwich at midday, but eventually, doors opened wider and entire meals were shared. It was here, on these farms in the American heartland, that the first bonds of unexpected hospitality took root. The first invitations came hesitantly, almost by accident. In many rural towns, after long hours in the fields, it was natural for farmers to offer a drink of water or a slice of bread to the men who worked alongside them. Guards, usually stationed at a respectful distance, seldom interfered with these small gestures, recognizing that hospitality was part of the American way of life. What began as refreshments under the shade of a barn or at the edge of a field soon developed into something more personal. Farmers' wives, watching these weary young men who could have been their own sons, sometimes offered a hot lunch inside the kitchen. For the prisoners, stepping across the threshold of an American home was an experience both alien and unforgettable. Accounts from Iowa and Minnesota describe how, after weeks of steady work and good conduct, families began to view certain prisoners as trustworthy. Some spoke enough English to hold halting conversations, while others relied on gestures, smiles, and shared laughter to bridge the language barrier. A few American families of German descent found communication easier, speaking in dialects that reminded the POWs of home. These familiar sounds, Schwäbisch, Plattdeutsch, or Bavarian, created an unexpected sense of kinship, blurring the line between enemy and neighbor. For the Germans, being invited indoors was not simply about food, it was about dignity. They were no longer just laborers behind fences, but guests welcomed, however briefly, as part of a household. Sitting at polished wooden tables, seeing framed photographs on the walls, smelling coffee freshly brewed, it was a stark contrast to the barracks and the clang of mess trays. In diaries preserved after the war, many POWs wrote that these moments of hospitality struck them more deeply than any abundance of rations. From the American perspective, extending such trust was not without controversy. Some townspeople whispered disapproval, believing it dangerous to allow Nazis into private homes. Local newspapers occasionally carried editorials warning against becoming too familiar with prisoners. Yet in practice, the relationships built on farms often grew quietly, away from the public eye. Farmers depended on these men, saw their decency firsthand, and came to believe that kindness would not weaken patriotism, but demonstrate the values America claimed to defend. One farmer in Texas later recalled how, after inviting 2 POWs to join his family for lunch, his children began asking them about their families back in Germany. The prisoners spoke of mothers who baked bread on Sundays, of sisters who sang in church choirs, of small villages surrounded by fields, not unlike those of the American Midwest. For the farmer, it was a revelation. The enemy shared the same simple ties of family, work, and tradition. Invitations spread slowly. At first, only the most trusted POWs were allowed such privileges. But by late 1944, stories circulated among prisoners about entire afternoons spent inside homes, of apple pies baked by American women, of children bringing out board games or showing off schoolwork. These glimpses into civilian life were moments of reprieve from captivity and reminders of the humanity they thought long lost in the war. For the Germans, these encounters planted seeds of astonishment. They had been raised under a regime that taught them to expect cruelty from enemies, to anticipate revenge and hatred. Instead, they found that strangers thousands of miles from their homeland extended open hands and warm meals. The foundation was being laid for something extraordinary, an experience that would crystallize most vividly on Sunday afternoons, when family traditions reached their peak. By the time autumn settled over the farmlands of the Midwest and the South, a pattern had emerged. What began as simple gestures of kindness grew into something more ceremonial, invitations to Sunday dinners. In rural America, Sunday was more than just another day. It was a rhythm of life. Families rose early for church, fields lay still, and kitchens came alive with the smells of roasting meat, fresh bread, and pies cooling on windowsills. For German prisoners accustomed to military rations and the austerity of camp kitchens, stepping into this ritual felt almost unreal. The first moments were always the most striking. After attending church under guard or waiting outside while families worshipped, some POWs were guided into homes where tables had been set with care. White tablecloths stretched across wooden tables, cutlery polished, and candles sometimes lit. The POWs, often hesitant, stood awkwardly until urged to sit. A farmer's wife would place bowls of mashed potatoes, platters of roast chicken, or steaming casseroles in front of them. It was not only the abundance of food, but the atmosphere of intimacy that stunned them. To be seated beside the very people whose nation was at war with theirs, and to be treated not as an enemy, but as a guest, defied every expectation. Children played a role in breaking down barriers. Many German soldiers had left families behind and found themselves disarmed by the innocence of American boys and girls who asked them questions or tugged at their sleeves. POWs who had once marched through occupied towns now found themselves teaching American children simple German words or carving wooden toys after meals. One memoir recalls how a prisoner in Nebraska used a pocket knife to carve a small horse from a piece of firewood and gave it to the farmer's daughter, who treasured it long after the war ended. The meals themselves were feasts by wartime standards. America's farms, though rationed, still produced enough to maintain generous spreads. Prisoners later wrote in astonishment about eating fresh butter, drinking cold milk straight from the farm, and tasting pies filled with apples or cherries. For men who had last eaten fruit years before, the sweetness seemed like a dream. Some even confessed to feelings of guilt. How could they, as defeated soldiers, sit at overflowing tables while their families in Germany stood in bread lines or hid in bomb shelters? What also left a deep impression was the ritual of prayer before meals. Many American families bowed their heads, giving thanks not only for the food, but sometimes also for the safety of those gathered. To hear prayers spoken aloud, including blessings for those far from home, humbled the German POWs. It reminded them of their own traditions when mothers and fathers had prayed for sons gone to war. In that quiet, shared moment of reverence, the boundaries of nationality seemed to blur. Newspapers occasionally reported on these unusual gatherings, and military authorities sometimes frowned upon such familiarity. Yet they seldom interfered unless security was at risk. For the most part, the Army allowed local customs to unfold, recognizing that goodwill kept the POWs cooperative and lessened tensions in the surrounding communities. Farmers who hosted Germans defended their actions, insisting it was not sympathy for Nazism, but simply an expression of Christian hospitality. These Sunday dinners etched themselves into memory. To the prisoners, they symbolized a profound contradiction. While war still raged across Europe and American soldiers fought on distant fronts, here in the quiet heart of America, they experienced warmth, laughter, and kindness from those who had every reason to despise them. It was a dissonance that many could never forget, and it became the highlight of their captivity. The Sunday gatherings did more than fill stomachs. They opened doors to cultural exchange that neither side had anticipated. Around dining tables or on porches after meals, conversations stumbled forward through fragments of English, bits of German, and a great deal of hand gestures. What began as awkward exchanges grew into meaningful dialogue, where families and prisoners discovered how much of their lives overlapped despite the war. Some American families of German ancestry became natural interpreters, allowing both sides to move beyond nods and smiles into real conversations about farming techniques, family traditions, and the everyday hardships of wartime life. Music often served as a bridge. In several accounts, prisoners brought harmonicas or small accordions with them on work assignments. After dinner, children begged them to play. Soon, German folk songs filled American living rooms, melodies that spoke of mountains, rivers, and villages far away. The tunes carried nostalgia for the prisoners, while for Americans they were a curiosity, a window into another culture. In return, families introduced the POWs to American hymns, country ballads, or even swing music played on the radio. Laughter often erupted when Germans tried to mimic the rhythms of Glenn Miller or Bing Crosby, their accents transforming English lyrics into something endearing rather than strange. Food also became a source of exchange. Though the meals were American in character, German prisoners sometimes offered suggestions or shared recipes remembered from home. One Nebraska family later recalled how a POW showed them how to bake rye bread in a more traditional German style, which became a household favorite even after the war. In Texas, prisoners introduced families to sauerkraut preparation, and in return, they tasted chili for the first time, grimacing at the spice, but eventually warming to it. Religion, too, played a subtle role. Many Germans were Catholic or Protestant, and they recognized familiar rituals in their hosts' practices. When invited to attend church services, some prisoners felt uneasy under the gaze of congregations, yet they were struck by the absence of hatred in the sermons. American pastors spoke of forgiveness, compassion, and faith in humanity, themes that contrasted sharply with the propaganda-laden speeches they had once heard in Germany. These moments deepened the sense that they were being accepted not as enemies, but as fellow human beings in need of grace. There were also exchanges of stories about the war itself, though such conversations were delicate. Families often wanted to know what life was like in Germany, and prisoners cautiously described the destruction of cities or the scarcity of food without delving into politics. Some spoke fondly of orchards, forests, or harvest festivals, steering clear of discussions about Hitler or ideology. In turn, Americans described ration books, air raid drills on the coasts, or the absence of fathers and brothers serving overseas. These mutual confessions revealed common struggles that transcended national borders. Children, once again, were catalysts. They asked prisoners to tell them fairy tales, and the Germans recounted stories of Hansel and Gretel or Rumpelstiltskin, which the children recognized from their own versions. Shared folklore created an unexpected bond, proving that cultures divided by war still carried echoes of the same stories. These cultural exchanges became the most enduring legacy of the Sunday meals. Beyond the warmth of roasted chicken or apple pie, they represented a meeting of worlds, where two sides who should have been locked in hatred found themselves learning from one another. The war was not forgotten. It lingered in every letter from the front, every casualty report. But for a few hours each week, in kitchens and dining rooms across America, human connection overpowered politics and ideology. Long after the plates had been cleared and the war eventually ended, the memories of those dinners lingered with the prisoners more than any other detail of their captivity. When the surrender of Germany came in May 1945 and the long process of repatriation began, many POWs carried home more than just their belongings. They carried stories. In battered notebooks and letters written during their final months in the United States, they recorded impressions of American homes, of children's laughter, of the taste of fresh milk and baked pies. These recollections became treasures, reminders that even in the midst of conflict, they had encountered kindness from those they had once imagined as merciless foes. Some of the most vivid testimonies appear in memoirs published decades later. Former prisoners recounted how those family meals reshaped their understanding of America. They had expected vengeance and hostility, yet found hospitality and compassion. A number of them admitted that these moments softened the bitterness of defeat. Rather than returning to Germany consumed by resentment, they brought back with them a cautious respect for the humanity of their former enemies. For many, these experiences stood in sharp contrast to the propaganda they had absorbed throughout the war, propaganda that painted Americans as decadent, violent, and morally corrupt. The impact was not only personal, but also cultural. In the late 1940s, as Germany struggled with devastation and the beginnings of Allied occupation, stories of humane treatment abroad circulated among veterans. Tales of Sunday dinners in Nebraska or coffee shared in Texas kitchens gave a different picture of the United States than the one spread by Nazi propaganda. In conversations among families and communities, these stories carried weight, gradually influencing how Germans thought about reconciliation. One striking example comes from a group of former POWs who had worked on farms in Kansas. Upon their return to Germany, they formed a small circle that met regularly to exchange letters and memories of their time in America. Some of them even corresponded with the American families who had once hosted them, maintaining friendships across the ocean. Decades later, in the 1960s, a few returned as visitors, standing again at the thresholds of the houses where they had once sat as reluctant guests. The warmth they received upon return confirmed that those dinners had been more than temporary gestures. They were lasting bridges between individuals and cultures. The memories also influenced how many POWs raised their children. Former soldiers who had once believed only in discipline and obedience, the repetition of these stories reshaped perceptions. It was difficult to demonize a nation when so many former POWs recalled evenings of laughter, prayer, and warmth in American kitchens. Historians later noted that these personal accounts subtly prepared the ground for the gradual acceptance of U.S. influence in West Germany during the years of Reconstruction. The long-term impact was also visible in literature and remembrance culture. Diaries smuggled back from camps, later published or donated to archives, revealed not only the monotony of confinement, but also the extraordinary episodes of hospitality. Letters preserved by families show careful descriptions of American customs. The tradition of setting aside Sunday as a family day, the practice of saying grace before meals, and the casual friendliness of children who asked questions without fear. These details humanized the enemy in ways official propaganda could not erase. Some ex-POWs forged enduring connections. In the 1950s and 1960s, correspondence blossomed between German veterans and the American families who had once opened their doors to them. Postcards with photographs of rebuilt German towns crossed paths with letters describing American harvests or high school graduations. A handful of former prisoners returned to the United States, this time as tourists or immigrants. They stood again in front of farmhouses in Iowa or barns in Texas, now as free men welcomed by descendants of those who had once hosted them during the war. The legacy also extended into education and diplomacy. By the 1970s, oral histories collected from former POWs became valuable resources for scholars studying reconciliation. Veterans gave interviews in which they contrasted their experiences in America with those of comrades who had been held in Soviet camps. The stark differences often told their sons and daughters about the unexpected kindness of strangers. They emphasized lessons of tolerance and the importance of seeing the humanity even in those labeled as enemies. Oral histories collected in the 1990s reveal that for some German families, these recollections became a cornerstone of post-war identity, a reminder that survival depended not only on strength, but also on the willingness to forgive and to accept generosity. Even in cases where prisoners had returned to cities in ruins, the memories of American hospitality remained intact. Amid shortages, political tension, and the struggle of rebuilding, stories of dinners with American families were told almost like parables, moments when the cruelty of war gave way to fleeting glimpses of peace. For men who had lived through the brutality of the Eastern Front or the bombing of Hamburg, these recollections provided hope that reconciliation between nations was possible. The Sunday dinners, simple as they seemed, thus became more than meals. They became enduring symbols, shaping not only the individual memories of thousands of POWs, but also the broader narrative of how former enemies could one day become partners in rebuilding a shattered world. When the final repatriations unfolded between 1946 and 1947, the war was already history, but the echoes of captivity in America endured. Ships carried thousands of German prisoners back across the Atlantic, depositing them in a homeland transformed by ruin and hunger. Many stepped onto German soil with torn uniforms and empty pockets, but their minds were crowded with vivid impressions of their time in the United States. What they told their families often contradicted expectations. Husbands returned to wives who imagined stories of cruelty and starvation, yet instead they described orchards heavy with fruit, respectful guards, and astonishingly, Sunday dinners shared in strangers' homes. These testimonies became part of a larger post-war dialogue. In towns scarred by bombing, neighbors gathered to hear returning soldiers recount their experiences. Some spoke quietly, fearing that tales of generosity from Americans might be viewed as disloyal. But over time, abundance versus deprivation, respect versus brutality, reinforced their sense that their treatment in the U.S. had been a turning point in their view of the world. These stories were retold at family gatherings, shaping how younger generations of Germans perceived not only the war, but also the idea of enemy nations. In America, the memory of POWs faded more quickly, but in small towns, older residents still recalled the Germans who had worked the fields, joined in harvest suppers, and sat at their Sunday tables. For them, the war had brought unexpected guests who had left behind hand-carved toys, pressed flowers in notebooks, or even recipes passed along to American kitchens. These traces became part of local folklore, reminders that even in global conflict, human connection had quietly flourished. Thus, the story did not end with the closing of the camps. The experiences of German POWs who once sat at American Sunday dinners lived on, shaping post-war relationships, influencing attitudes toward reconciliation, and proving that simple gestures of kindness can leave legacies as powerful as any battle. The war's violence had divided nations, but across farm tables in quiet towns, seeds of understanding had been planted, destined to grow long after the guns had fallen silent.